The next section of lectures will be about Aristotle's ethics, his view of virtues and vices. I'm going to start out with a shorter paper about raising children. It's called Raising Aristotelian Children in a Postmodern World. This article was published in the International Journal of Decision Ethics, Volume 7, Number 3, from the summer of 2011. The greatest gift parents can give to their children is integrity. The word integrity implies integration, the integration of emotions, thoughts, and actions. We want our children to desire to live the best lives they're able to live, given their natural abilities. Within the context of developing a talent or skill which will lead to a career, children also need to develop practical and theoretical wisdom. In what follows, I will summarize Aristotle's view of the character traits which together constitute the completely human life. Aristotle's model is based on human nature, so it ought to be applicable to any human being, regardless of when or where they live. Certain aspects of Aristotle's model clearly reflect his own cultural biases, particularly his attitude toward women. Since Aristotle himself would not think anything he said was true because he said it, he would think his claims should be corrected in light of further evidence. If a Muslim or a Hindu has a similar model, Aristotle would not hold any prejudice against another cultural tradition. A claim is true because it's true, because it conforms to the standard of human nature by nature, regardless of the particular cultural language or associations attached to it. This goes back to the correspondence theory of truth. A claim is true because it's true. It corresponds to the outside world, and a person who's wise is living the truth. So you want your children to grow up being able as adults to live the truth. Ultimately, that will make them happy, and anything less than that will make them less happy, no matter how difficult life can get. According to Aristotle, the goal of human life is happiness, defined as, quote, activities of soul in conformity with excellence, and if there are more than one type of excellence, in conformity with the best and most complete, in a complete life. Now the word activities is energia, energy. The word for soul is psyche, and the word for excellence is arete. So we have to remember those. We also have to remember that if you develop your capacities to the highest level possible, as many as possible, for as long as possible, so living a complete life is important. And Aristotle would say most academics today do not live complete lives. They live isolated lives. They live lives that emphasize certain capabilities, the intellectual virtues, but they're very indifferent to the moral virtues, or minimally exercise them. And they don't get rewarded for exercising many of the moral virtues. Okay, one kind of excellence is doing noble actions. And again, the word noble has all these awful associations with old white male aristocrats. But it doesn't mean that. So let's forget that association. It means doing excellent actions. Doing actions that are the fulfillment of human nature, and they indicate that the specimen, the member of the species, is flourishing, is exercising their own well-functioning. Okay. Quote, the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant, and excellent actions are such, unquote. On the other hand, quote, for most people their pleasures are in conflict with one another because they are not by nature pleasant, unquote. Aristotle knows that human beings disagree, even on the most basic starting point of action, on whether human excellence is the goal of human life. Quote, "For wickedness perverts us and causes us to be deceived about the starting points of action." So there are people who believe that a flourishing person is a rich person, or an impulsive person, or a powerful person, or a person who's respected in their community apart from whether they deserve some respect. I mean, he's not ignorant. He understands that. He still thinks, despite all the variability, we can get down to some basic principles and patterns because the universe is by nature ordered, and human society has certain levels of order and pattern in it, and we are capable of understanding those. Still, we can theoretically set down that every child deserves to be raised to desire excellent actions, because such a desire is the best way for them as adults to have integrity, the union of desire, thought, and a life dedicated to the pursuit of human excellence. Aristotle emphasizes temperance, or self-control, as a fundamental precondition for practical wisdom, because it preserves one's practical wisdom. Quote, "What it preserves is a belief about what is good and bad for human beings, for it is not every belief that pleasant and painful objects destroy and pervert, but only beliefs about what is to be done." So you can have a lot of intellectual virtues. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's not perverted by pleasures and pains. That's emotionally detached. But the view of happiness, the view of flourishing, can be perverted if you have the wrong desires. Aristotle emphasizes the importance of monitoring pleasure and pain in oneself, because it can so easily be corrupted and lead to bad judgments about how to act in any given situation. The malleability of pleasure and pain among human beings can easily lead to the belief that morality is relative, that there are no objective standards for good and evil. Aristotle recognizes the problem, yet he gives a completely natural, universal foundation for the origin of virtue and vice. We are born experiencing pleasure and pain because we're animals, yet as human beings, we're capable of being raised to take pleasure in actions that we will ultimately recognize as the most fulfilling, because we know that we want to do the right thing for the right reason in the right way. The pleasures proper to a human being are those connected with the exercise of their highest powers, those powers of thought and action unique to our species. Quote, "Each animal is thought to have a proper pleasure, as it has a proper function." Unquote. At birth we have the potential to become either good or evil. Quote, "Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature, do excellences arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit." Unquote. If we are to become adults who find ways to act virtuously and justly because we take pleasure in such activities, we have to grow up doing such things and taking pleasure in them. Quote, "We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts." So we aren't virtuous because we talk about virtue or think we're virtuous. We have to do things. The virtues and vices are incarnated. They're based on how we live, on what we do, on the choices we make. Therefore, says Aristotle, quote, "Right education is to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and be pained by the things that we ought." Unquote. Only well-raised children will benefit greatly from the study of ethics and politics when they get older. Quote, "Argument and teaching are not powerful with all people, but the soul of the student must first have been cultivated by means of habits for noble joy and noble hatred, unquote. So by the time students come to college to get a liberal education, the ones that are teachable are the ones who want to find something worth living for, who want to link their motivations and their talents and their need for an income, but they're not going to dedicate themselves to doing whatever is necessary to get rich or famous or something like that. Students like that, if they really are determined, are uneducable because they don't believe in the basic first principle. The students of ethics and politics who flourish from such a study are the ones who actually want to be wise, and so they learn the patterns and principles necessary so they can categorize their lives in terms of patterns and principles and learn about what ancient authors, the wisdom passed down about what's best in a certain kind of situation and what kind of life is best. Young people must study ethics and politics in order to become completely virtuous, just, and happy. Good habits are necessary but not sufficient for human virtue. Quote, "From the very moment of birth, we are just, or fitted for self-control, or brave, or have the other moral qualities, but yet we seek something else as that which is good in the strict sense. We seek for the presence of such qualities in another way." Unquote. So children grow up imitating the people around them, developing habits, but eventually they have to ask why, and they have to establish a foundation based on reason and reasoning as the source of their choice and motivation. Young people have to make the transition from living according to what other people say and by habit alone to living according to reason, choosing to maintain good habits and changing bad habits so that they conform to reason. Among adults, the proper motive for all choices has to be thought. Quote, "If a man once acquires thought, that makes a difference in action, and his state, or his character, which, while still like what it was, will then be excellent in the strict sense. In the moral part of the soul, the part that concerns emotions and actions, there are two types, natural excellence and excellence in the strict sense, and of these the latter involves practical wisdom. It is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, nor practically wise without moral excellence." Unquote. After consistently performing noble actions and taking pleasure from them, these ways of behaving become parts of our character. Quote, "States arise out of like activities." So the activities are the energia, the energy, and then if you conduct yourself, if that kind of energy, for example, you like being generous, you like helping other people, you can get to the point where that's your character. That's just what you do. It's part of your life. In order to be a courageous person, for example, one must have grown up facing dangerous situations in the right way. A well-raised child will face fear because authority figures tell them to and show them through example how to do so. A child or young person might do the same action in a given situation that an adult would do, but do not understand it in the broader context of an expression of human excellence. Such actions are not courageous because they're not performed for the right reason. At a certain point, education is necessary to understand the natural and psychological foundations of all the virtues, including courage. One then knows why a certain action was courageous and another rash or cowardly. Once an adult has become conscious of the definition of human happiness as the exercise of all the excellences, he or she deliberately acts courageously and can do so consistently because they have the proper habits, the proper desire, and the theoretical knowledge necessary to want to be courageous and to be able to be courageous. Quote, the acts that are in accordance with the excellences have themselves a certain character. The agent also must be in a certain condition when he does them. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts, and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. This is totally different from utilitarianism or some other view that just looks at behavior. For example, you can watch someone give money away, but according to Aristotle, you don't know if that's a virtuous act or not. It might be motivated by greed. It might be motivated by the desire for status or power. You just don't know by simply observing the act. And over the long run, you'll have a much healthier person and a much better society if you stay focused on the cultivation of character as the goal, not simply behaviors that are observable. We have to know the character that motivated them, or the why, the causes and principles. Aristotle's list of virtues claims to be comprehensive, but again, he would agree to modifications or additions. The personal virtues are courage, temperance, liberality, like generosity, magnificence, proper ambition, sociability, a sense of humor, friendship, high-mindedness or proper pride, gentleness, and truthfulness. The virtues in relationship to people we do not know are hitting the mean in relation to the pleasure that comes from profit, knowing what is just and best in the rectification of wrongs, knowing how to best distribute social goods to promote human well-being, knowing how to apply a law to a specific case, knowing the difference between justice as obedience to the particular laws of one's particular society, and knowing whether one's nation's laws conform to the broader standards of justice, living in accordance with the rule of law unless one's society is particularly corrupt, and having an overall sense of responsibility for one's actions, so as to avoid possible neglect or wrongdoing. Finally, the art of legislation, knowing how to make good laws, is the art of statesmanship, and the purpose of laws is to promote human flourishing. So you do have a standard according to which you can evaluate laws as better or worse. Aristotle thinks that human beings are responsible for knowing the difference between the mean and extremes. Each of the virtues is a mean between extremes. We know when we eat too much or too little, when we get too angry or not angry enough. Now this varies from culture to culture, but not completely, okay? There's the basic structure based on the human condition. Then there's the variability depending on culture. Cultures might change, things like that. So, the person of practical wisdom wants to quote-unquote hit the mark, which means to do what's best. Quote, there is a mark to which the man who possesses reason looks, and heightens or relaxes his activity accordingly. And there's a standard which determines the mean states which we say are intermediate between excess and defect, being in accordance with right reason. Unquote. The distinguishing mark of a person of practical wisdom is the ability to know what action in a particular situation will be most conducive to promoting the human good in general, not just to his own good or that of those he knows. Quote, it is thought to be the mark of a man of practical wisdom to be able to deliberate well about what is good and expedient for himself, not in some particular respect, that is, about what sorts of things conduce to health or to strength, but about what sorts of things conduce to the good life in general. Unquote. People who are good parents, friends, and rulers have practical wisdom. Quote, we consider that those who can do this are good at managing households and states. unquote. We can only deliberate about things which are in our power, and we deliberate about them because we are conscious that we have choices about what to do. We are conscious that we can act in one way or another way. Quote, now, if it is in our power to do noble or base acts, and likewise in our power not to do them, and this was what being good or bad meant, then it is in our power to be virtuous or vicious. Unquote. If it is in our power to be good or evil, then, quote, men are themselves responsible for being unjust or self-indulgent. Unquote. If children were not given the correct habits, they cannot be completely practically wise as adults, but they can have the characteristic of moral strength. Morally strong people know what is best, but do not want to do it, yet they act on their reason and not on their desire. Even if a vice becomes so deeply embedded that it is second nature, adults are responsible for the characters they have. Quote, to the unjust and self-indulgent person, it was open at the beginning not to become people of this kind, and so they are such voluntarily. Now that they've become so, it's not possible for them not to be so. So they might habitually seek to be as wealthy as possible, but they can still make plenty of choices which will not lead to that goal because of moral strength. Aristotle's list is a good starting point for a universal conversation. We can compare these character traits with the way people in other societies at various times have been conditioned to address the same types of situations. Since the situations are defined in ways that every human being can identify with, it is possible to distinguish between what aspects of human life do not change over time, what kinds of experiences and what aspects do change, how people are molded to react. If the project is approached with due care, a universal ethic can be developed. This vision is complex and difficult to achieve because we are complex and interesting creatures. The reason people disagree is not because morals are relative, but because excellent is difficult. Laws and customs are formed for the purpose of providing more efficiently for the basic needs of life and for the purpose of preventing conflict between people. But that's not the only purpose or the primary purpose of developing complex ways of molding natural desires and establishing codes of good and evil, justice and injustice. Ancient Greek writers knew that they were trying to cultivate a higher level of human consciousness in more citizens than any other society they knew of, but they still believed this was natural. They recognized that many societies did not have the conditions necessary to cultivate complete human excellence in as many citizens as was possible in Greece. Among the Greeks, very few had the opportunity to develop the higher powers of their souls. Today, it is possible to cultivate human excellence in many more citizens than was possible in Greece. Whether a nation's constitution is based on an inherited monarchy, a ruling aristocracy, or the rule of law and leaders elected by a majority of citizens, the goal of all aspects of political life should be the cultivation of the powers of the human soul in as many citizens as possible. Societies are ranked according to whether they are developed or developing. The motive for development should not be just to give more people freedom, but to give more citizens the opportunity to develop their souls, their natural capacities for moral, intellectual, practical, and theoretical wisdom and virtue. Citizens around the world should be raised to love moderation in all things, and to nurture and exercise all of the virtues. More and more citizens should be given opportunities to govern themselves, locally, nationally, and internationally. They should nurture a culture in which the public good is discussed openly, and each citizen is willing to put aside their own desires, fears, and biases so they can see more clearly what is best for everyone and for their children and grandchildren collectively. What appears to be happening in the process of development today throughout the world is that greed is dominating the process. It appears that too many people are motivated too much by profits in the next few months, the next quarter, and in their company's stock prices in the next week. To make money at this frantic pace, companies must appeal to the most immediate, irrational, and excess desires. Lust, pride, envy, greed, sloth, and gluttony, among others, are promoted as the highest goals in life, or as emotions and drives we have by nature. And of course we know now the way advertising appeals to 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, very young children, so that they develop this habit of being impulsive at such a young age that they become hardened. This is really worrisome. If what appears to be the case truly is the case, we have completely reversed the priorities Aristotle, or anyone interested in the cultivation of virtue, justice, truth, and wisdom, would demand. We will pass on to our children excess desires, the double curse of being both internally conflicted and of getting caught up in competitive, adversarial, and superficial relationships with other people. We will destroy our natural environment. We will compete with and fear being overpowered by those we do not know. We will grow xenophobic even as we become more and more connected through trade and the internet. If a meaningful model of the completely developed human soul is the best way, perhaps the only way, to give a rational account of why a superficial and irrational understanding of development is both wrong and self-destructive, then philosophers, and the kind of liberal philosophical education they provide, is the greatest gift to any society. A society will ultimately destroy itself from within if it feels threatened by teachers who try to pass on a passion for wisdom among their students, without favoring any one nation, religion, ethnicity, sex, or any other bias, except human nature and the human condition itself. Many societies, including the Athenians, have tried to silence the philosophical voices in their midst. In the end, however, the voice itself continues to emerge because it's based on the only substantial meaning of the word truth. Human language can be said to be true or false, depending upon whether what is said corresponds, however indirectly, to the unchanging foundations of human life, the experience of being a creature with the capacity to understand, living in a physical and cultural universe that can be understood. We will never cease to inquire about the world around us, natural and cultural, and we will never be happy when we pervert or fail to exercise our natural desire to seek order in nature, in ourselves, and in our societies. Our greatest gift to our children is to make them as conscious as possible of this natural drive for curiosity and for the cultivation of all the natural powers of their souls. Once they know themselves as by nature lovers of wisdom, they can grow into mature adults who know they have the right goals, who know they will make tragic mistakes, who know they will learn and move on, and who know that corrupt leaders, co-workers, and acquaintances cannot corrupt them. As philosophers, we must continually remind ourselves of our important mission in society, to model the love of wisdom, and to pass this passion down from one generation to the next, even though the general public might think of us as absent-minded professors with our heads in the clouds. However, if we do our job well, we will give to our fellow citizens a model of the best human life that is true and intelligible. Even if it takes an effort to understand and to honor, we can know we are making our unique and essential contribution to the future of humankind. This is as much as we can do. It is our gift to humanity and to posterity. So I understand that on the first hearing, this might seem biased, culturally biased. Aristotle's just talking about himself. Um, but again, if you bear with me and we go through all the different aspects of Greek culture, I want to just point out that there is a pattern in the human condition, and that's what these writers tried to understand and to educate us about the good life and all the ways we can go wrong so that we can flourish, so that we can promote the flourishing of as many people as possible to the highest level possible. Of course, in this era of globalization, in theory, societies are trying, often in the name of becoming more democratic, but the point really is they're trying, in theory, to cultivate the powers of the souls of citizens, more and more citizens, to a higher level than they have been before. One example of this would be women. Supposedly, the globalization, at least when I was in college, the idea was we're going to give women access to education and to power and to all the things that society has to offer because they've been unjustly oppressed. They've been defined as by nature inferior, like Aristotle did, and treated that way. But we found out that that's a mistake, and we assume Aristotle, if he were alive today, would admit the facts. He's not stuck in his ways. And we can cultivate education of women. Now, obviously, someone my age who got a PhD in philosophy focused on development, meaning access of women to education. I have friends, women friends, who are 10 years older than me, maybe 15, who really couldn't study philosophy in PhD programs. One at Princeton, one at Catholic University, because they were women. So it wasn't that long ago. Plus, the profession was 85% male when I joined into it, and it still isn't. It's still, I think, at least 2/3 male. But, but when you go abroad and when I travel, when I go to Indonesia, developing countries, the appearance of development appears to be simply the pursuit of pleasure and power and status. And so you have all this advertising with all these sexy nymphette women, or sports cars, or wealthy people promoting, their wealth and status. It's really, really disappointing. But again, all we can do is, as philosophers, try to educate our students who want to be educated. Now, it seems obvious to me that moral relativism is not going to solve this problem. You can't say, oh, it's all relative, because something else is definitely going on here. And to say, oh, morals are just relative, is to cover up what's really going on, which is greed is driving the process. Now, later on, or in the next lecture, I'll point out that Aristotle, and later on Plato, I'll point out, thought that greed is the political evil. This is exactly the opposite of the direction we're going right now. They say the desire for more than your share is what creates a huge gap between the rich and the poor, eliminates the middle class, and you can't have a stable society unless you have a strong and stable middle class. Now, the size of the middle class, how affluent they actually are, varies. But instability is caused by people comparing themselves to each other, and people thinking that they have opportunity to develop themselves, and then actually having the opportunity. Now, how much opportunity a just ruler can provide for citizens varies, but when the power is used to help cultivate the souls of the citizens, that's justice. And when it's not, when the power is used to help promote the wealth or status or power of the people who have it, then you have an unjust society. And I think these are the kind of patterns that don't change. That's what we'll pursue in these lectures and in tragedy. Now, the particular circumstances vary a lot, but we can find those underlying principles and patterns and the kind of energy, the way people actually incarnate virtues or vices, justice or injustice. Aristotle's theory can be combined with Homer, the tragedies, and Plato, and you can see how his definitions are actually lived out in the real world. One other important thing Aristotle said was that virtue is not a logos, it's not a definition. You can get the definitions right and be a totally vicious person. As a matter of fact, when vicious people learn ethical theory, they have a much more powerful tool for performing their wickedness because they know how to create the appearance of being virtuous. They know how to talk the talk and cover up what they're really doing. So a logos, a definition, isn't at all related to the actual reality of virtue. Virtue is an ergon. Ergon means a way of life. So a person cannot be that intellectually intelligent and yet be morally virtuous, because their way of life is the incarnation of the moral virtues. A person can be intellectually very sophisticated and yet morally perverted, wicked, or just weak. And that's a theme that goes on over and over. So in the next lecture, I will talk more about Aristotle's virtues, the difference between moral and intellectual virtues, and I'll try to show that his categories represent these patterns that you can use to evaluate even what were called primitive societies. Now, it's important that Western educated anthropologists, archaeologists in the past have either called less developed societies primitive, or else they will claim that it's relative. They're no better or worse. Alright, some do anyway. Now, Aristotle's view rejects both of those. First of all, a society can cultivate the souls of its citizens to a less complex degree because it's a more simple society, and yet the people can have moral virtues, and they can have a much higher level of moral virtue than people in a high-tech society and a sophisticated society who have more intellectual capacity, but who basically are deprived of the moral virtues. So you can have somebody who's a highly trained techie who's greedy, and you can't have a hierarchy. That's not a better society morally, or even in terms of human flourishing, than one where people are less educated in the intellectual virtues, but they practice moral virtue to a much greater extent. So if the goal of happiness is exercising all the virtues in a complete life, you could argue that some of those societies that are less sophisticated intellectually have citizens that are actually exercising more of the virtues than other citizens in the intellectually oriented society. The other thing is that even though it appears to be that societies are so different, you can take a what was considered a backward society. You can go onto some island, like I was in Indonesia, so Papua New Guinea, right? They even have, they've learned how to exploit their backward culture by selling tours. I think they're called eco tours or something, and look at all these primitives and how they behave. It's pretty ridiculous. But anyway, you can evaluate those remote island societies according to the same virtues. They might understand self-control a little differently, but every society has a standard for the mean and the extremes. And also for justice, you can evaluate what the powers of the leaders are and whether the leaders are exercising those powers for the well-being of the ruled or not. You can evaluate whether they have good intentions, but they're not competent to make good judgments, or any number of things. I know that people associate Aristotle's categories with fuddy-duddy privileged old white guys, and I know why, because I've met enough of them. And it's unfortunate that philosophy has predominantly fuddy-duddy old white guys, or maybe they're not so old. Um, and these people tend to project their own characters into the texts because there's nothing in the theory itself that doesn't allow for an analysis of Papua New Guinea culture or any culture. So we have to just free ourselves from our projections and our assumptions and our own habits and customs. Just release ourselves from that and realize what this actually means when you're thinking about different cultures as better or worse. And have as the gold standard this cultivation of the souls of the citizens. And I'll show later on in a few lectures that the United Nations has this model, and it is an Aristotelian type of model, or Aristotle has a capabilities type of model. It doesn't really matter which way you describe it. But if we just take Aristotle's model and realize, stop projecting our own assumptions or his own assumptions, and just we can use it. The UN actually does use it, and it's a very important tool. So that's what I really would like to do. One of the things I would like to do in my lectures.